Y este anillo que tú me dices hace 3 años, quiero que te cases conmigo.
No. No. Dilo claramente.
No.
No, es un no claro. ¿No quieres casarte con Ricardo? No.
5 days after this awkward interaction, 30-year-old Svetlana Orlova was murdered by the same man who just asked her to marry him. On Wednesday, November 14, 2007, Svetlana Orlova went to a popular Spanish TV show thinking she would be surprised by a family member from Russia she hadn't seen in a long time. Instead, her ex-boyfriend, Ricardo, showed up begging her to take him back. The host and the audience encouraged her to say something, but Svetlana just sat there, smiling awkwardly with her mouth, but not her eyes. What nobody in that set or watching the show at home knew was that just a few days earlier, a judge had signed a restraining order, and Ricardo had been sentenced to 11 months in prison for domestic violence against Svetlana. And what nobody even imagined was that 5 days after the show, Svetlana would be killed by the same man who had proposed to her on national television. This is the case of Svetlana Orlova, and how her tragic murder transformed the media treatment of violence against women in Spain. From 2001 to 2011, El Diario de Patricia, later known just as El Diario after it changed hosts, filled in 2 hours of airtime on Spanish television from Monday to Friday. The talk show would select a topic for the day, and regular people would come in and take part in the conversation, telling their own stories. The show featured many different narratives: families reuniting after decades, parents desperate with their children's behavior, early 2000s internet couples meeting for the first time, and the very popular couples getting back together after a fight. In many occasions, one of the guests was lured into the show with a different excuse, only to be surprised live when the person who invited them would come out and reveal the real reason they were there. These were the audience's favorite stories, since they always led to the awkward and funny interactions the show came to be known for. El Diario de Patricia became a staple in Spanish culture for its terrible guest selection, awkward encounters, and, overall, being bad TV. In fact, in the decade it was on air, it became one of the most criticized shows for not following media guidelines on prime time in regards to the protection of minors. Topics quickly escalated to sexual talk, insults, and other inappropriate content that was meant to be heavily regulated to protect children. One of the problems that led to chaotic and awkward moments was that the program never really researched the stories or the guests involved. Guests would be surprised by people they didn't know or care for. Stories turned out to be made up. This was part of the appeal of the show, and why so many people tuned in every day. It was easy entertainment. But this lack of research didn't just lead to bad TV. In 2007, El Diario de Patricia helped a domestic abuser with a recent sentence and a restraining order get together with the woman he had been terrorizing for years. Svetlana Orlova was 30 years old in 2007. She was Russian, but lived in Alicante, Spain, with her son from a previous relationship. On November 14, 2007, she was invited to El Diario de Patricia. All she knew was that someone wanted to surprise her. Excited, she went to the set, thinking it could be a family member from Russia she hadn't seen in a very long time. However, when the host, Patricia, asked her to look at the screen to discover why she was there, you can actually see her face completely change in just 1 second. On screen she saw Ricardo, her ex-boyfriend, who was there to ask her to take him back.
Sé que he fallado a mi pareja porque pidió un préstamo que no he podido pagar por los gastos de mi hijo, de la pensión, los gastos del piso. Ella se ha sentido estafada y me ha dejado. Pero en estos 4 años se da todo por ella. Es injusto.
¿Es cierto lo que dice Ricardo?
Lo del préstamo sí.
¿Y le has dejado por eso?
No,
¿Por qué ha sido?
por muchas más cosas.
¿Celos?
Por parte de él, sí.
Ricardo came out on set, and things got even more awkward. Earlier on the show, when interviewed by the host, he had admitted to being jealous, following her in the street. However, according to him, Svetlana and his relationship had ended because of money troubles, and he said he was willing to do whatever it took to get back with her. As soon as he sat down next to Svetlana, the tension was palpable, but Ricardo, determined to get her back, pulled out a ring and asked her to marry him, in front of the cameras and the audience.
Te quiero. La vida es solo una, como tú me dijiste, y yo la quiero vivir contigo. Y este anillo que tú me diste hace 3 años, quiero que te cases conmigo.
Svetlana just stared, with an awkward half-smile, but terror in her eyes.
Eres todo para mí. Todo. Todo. Sin ti no hay nada. Acéptalo. La vida es una. Y quiero vivirla contigo. Para siempre. Como pusiste en la anillo.
The host Patricia even encourages her to say something, to which she just responds, no.
Bueno, Svetlana, di algo, estamos todos aquí en vilo. ¿No o no sé?
Que
¿No? No. Dilo claramente.
no,
No, es un no claro. ¿No quieres casarte con Ricardo? No. ¿Quieres tener una relación con él? No. Se ha acabado.
The program moved on to the next guests, with a tense aftertaste, and Svetlana and Ricardo stayed there for the whole thing, sitting next to each other. When the show ended, it seemed like just another episode of awkwardness to add to the archives. However, 5 days later, it would become very clear why Svetlana had been so uncomfortable seeing Ricardo. On November 19th, just 5 days after Svetlana was on the show, she was found dead in the entrance to her building. Someone had slit her throat with a knife and left her there to die. The neighbors called the police, who were quick to point fingers at a suspect, Ricardo, Svetlana's ex-boyfriend, who had been sentenced to 11 months in prison for domestic violence. In fact, the only reason Ricardo hadn't been taken to prison yet was because he had managed to elude the police after his sentence. Witnesses and neighbors placed Ricardo at the scene, claiming the man had been ringing other apartments, asking if anyone had seen the Russian. Ricardo was arrested immediately. The case was quickly picked up by the media, and the couple's full story was uncovered. Ricardo and Svetlana had been together for 4 years, but their story was far from a fairy tale. He had been jealous and controlling from the start, and after years of abuse, Svetlana had taken him to court in March of 2007, after he hid some documents of hers and didn't allow her to leave the house. However, a month later, she gave him another chance, dropped the charges, and the couple was living together again, a scenario we often see among victims of domestic abuse. But in October of 2007, when the abuse hadn't stopped like he promised, she found the courage to stand up to Ricardo and took him to court again, this time leaving with a restraining order and Ricardo facing an 11-month sentence for domestic violence. She thought her nightmare was over, until she came face to face with him on television, where she felt pressured to nod along and just wait for the show to be over. Little did she know that 5 days later, she would be killed by the man asking her to marry him. For weeks, everyone in Spain was talking about the woman who had been on El Diario de Patricia and then killed 5 days later. And the main question was, how did the show allow a convicted abuser the police were looking for to blindly invite his victim to the show and propose on national TV? The general public was shocked that no background checks were done on the show, meaning victims were not safe from their abusers and could be lured onto a television set without being informed of who is waiting for them. The show's producers were quick to respond, defending themselves. They had no reason to believe they didn't get along, since Svetlana had even told the show she would perhaps have to leave her son with her ex-boyfriend, Ricardo, who often took care of him, to go on set when she still didn't know it was him who had invited her. They also mentioned both Svetlana and Ricardo left together after the show wrapped up, and neither of them seemed to be uncomfortable or exhibit any off behavior. These claims were not received well by the public, since they placed the blame on the victim for not openly saying something about her troubled past with Ricardo. But it's not easy for victims to speak up, especially after they've endured domestic abuse for years. Svetlana already had a restraining order and an 11-month prison sentence to protect her against Ricardo. So why should she be the one to openly talk about her trauma when cornered into a marriage proposal on live TV? And while it was very obvious to the police that Ricardo had been the killer, when arrested at his parents' house, he defended his innocence. He claimed to have been at his parents' apartment the afternoon Svetlana was murdered. However, one of the police officers who arrested him that day noticed he had cuts on his right hand and seemed to be under the influence of some kind of drug. Several witnesses also placed him at Svetlana's building, and some neighbors even recalled several incidents involving the couple and the police in the past, making it clear it was well known that Ricardo was violent. After a short trial, Ricardo was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the murder of Svetlana, as well as an additional 3 years for the domestic abuse she endured the previous years. A sentence that came too late for Svetlana. El Diario de Patricia was heavily criticized for years after the murder of Svetlana, and experts considered that while Ricardo would have probably murdered Svetlana eventually, the show did trigger that behavior in November of 2007. The public humiliation of being rejected on TV was enough for a controlling abuser like Ricardo to choose to kill his victim, as a way of proving he still held power over her. With the show refusing to take any accountability, new laws were passed to protect victims of domestic abuse and minors from situations like the ones Svetlana went through. In November 2007, the vice president of the Spanish government and the country's main media signed a deal in order to improve the way domestic violence is treated in the media. A small step into protecting the victims of domestic abuse and how their stories are told on television. Because sadly, Svetlana's case wasn't the first. In 1997, 60-year-old Ana Orantes was a guest at a regional talk show. The tone of this program was very different to El Diario de Patricia, since the show was openly talking about domestic abuse. In 1997, violence against women was still a huge taboo in Spain, and Ana became one of the first to open up about how her husband had been violent to her and her children for most of their lives together. She wanted to tell her story to inspire other women to take action, and to demand that authorities protect women from their abusive partners. 13 days later, her ex-husband burned her alive, ending her life after she publicly humiliated him. In this case, the killer was sentenced to 17 years in prison, and the crime opened up the Pandora's box of domestic abuse. In 1997, violence against women was still very frequent and very taboo. But Ana's open and honest testimony shone a light on a situation that couldn't continue being a secret. It gave a voice to the hundreds of thousands of women who suffered in silence. Laws were reviewed and became more severe to determine what domestic abuse was, to encourage victims to take action sooner and find the resources to be protected from the abusers. While the system isn't perfect, the public perception of violence against women has changed, and women now have more spaces to escape their nightmare. Women like Svetlana and Ana have paved the way to improvements in the safety of women in Spain, but their stories are still shocking. In the case of Svetlana, the television program that brought her face to face with her killer has never apologized to the family or taken any type of accountability for what happened, and remained on air until 2011.